Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Pleasure and privilege to have a chance to talk to Wendy James, who I've known for many years. Wendy, I always start by asking when and where you were born.
I was born in Timperley, Cheshire, Greater Manchester, and that was in 1940. My parents, in fact, were already living in different places at that time. Our family home was in Rochester, Kent, where my father was a secondary school teacher. My mother returned to her natal family for my birth. I was her first child. I'll just try to explain that after I was born, my mother returned to Rochester, Kent, to our family house. The problem was that this was a very insecure area because the Second World War was starting, and the ship yards and docks were being bombed in the Thames estuary. And the school was evacuated. My father's secondary school was evacuated to South Wales. So we were all, three of us, moved to a very tiny place in South Wales, in the valleys. And the problem was accommodation. All the kids and the teachers had to find accommodation with the local population. And the problem was that as a newborn baby, I wasn't terribly welcome. So at that point, my parents decided the best thing was for my mother to take me up to what was then Westmoreland, where she became a sort of assistant to an old friend of ours, Faye Henderson, who had a vegetarian guest house in the Lake District. So by 1941, my mother and I were taken up to the Lake District, and that became our base.
Let's go back. This is particularly relevant to anthropologists, to our ancestors a bit. Go back as far as you would like, either on your father's or mother's side, about people either particularly who you think might in some way have influenced you.
Well, my father's family, 2 or 3 generations previously, were farmers in central Wales. One of those ancestors, my father's father, I think, spoke Welsh. But the family gradually moved southwards to coastal areas of South Wales, and generation after generation the men married English-speaking women, so that my father didn't speak Welsh, but he had a slight Welsh accent. His father was the chief gardener in the city of Penarth, and laid out public gardens there, which you could see. My father was brought up as a very strong rationalist agnostic, and he was a scientist. He studied at Imperial College in London, chemistry, and he then did a master's degree in chemistry on Royal's Law, I think. He then went into secondary school teaching. He was a very important influence on me in that he loved travelling. As a young man, before he married, he spent a year in Canada, and has been known to have said that was the best year of his life before he ever met my mother. Later, he made a point of travelling as much as he could, especially to tropical countries. He spent some time seconded to the University College of the West Indies, as it then was, in the 50s, and to Africa, where he was seconded again to Macfarlane University in the 1950s. By this time I was a teenager, and I found my father's stories and pictures of Africa and the Caribbean very exciting. My father, however, I don't know very much about his family. He was regarded as a strange child because at the age of about 11 he decided he was not going to eat meat.
He was not going to what?
Eat meat.
Eat meat.
He
right.
went past a slaughterhouse and was so upset by what he saw that he just told his parents he was not going to eat meat. He did not know there was such a thing as a vegetarian. But as he got older, he joined the Vegetarian Society. In those days, they were very, very active. They had holidays and so on, and it was at a vegetarian summer holiday camp that my parents met. My mother, in an equally important way, has been an influence on me, partly because of this vegetarian connection through the family. I'm a fourth generation vegetarian if you mark it through the Macfarlane. My mother's mother's mother began it in Manchester. In our family on my mother's side, both my mother's parents came from Quaker, pacifist sort of backgrounds.
What did they do?
My mother's father was a chartered accountant in Manchester, and he had quite a large firm, and various other members of the family, in fact, became associated with it. One of my mother's brothers, she was the eldest of 4 children, one of her brothers became a partner in the same firm of my grandfather, Julius Lunt, in the course of time. So Manchester was a very important sort of family centre, much more than South Wales for me. In the course of the war, my father moved up to Westmoreland, and we all lived in Grasmere. The lady whose guest house my mother had been employed as an assistant, helping her, this guest house was bought by my parents in 1943, and my father got a job teaching in a local grammar school in Ambleside, Kelsick Grammar School. He became a science teacher there in 43. My mother, meanwhile, was building up this guest house at that time, Beck Allen's, right in the middle of Grasmere, which is now a timeshare flats. 1947, after the war, my father began to look for employment further away from home, and among other things, he taught in Workington. I think it was a sort of technical school in Workington, so he would commute to Workington on a weekly basis. He then got a job at Rossall School, a private school near Blackwell, Fleetwood, and he taught there for a while. And I think it was by about 1949 that an old friend of his, Tom Jarman, who was already established in the Institute of Education in the University of Bristol, said to my father, look, why don't you apply for a job here? There are plenty of jobs going, and indeed the whole university sector was expanding at that time. So my father, with his master's degree in chemistry, was welcome in Bristol University. By this time, 1947, not only was my mother making a great success of the vegetarian guest house at Beck Allen's, but my parents had bought an extra house, then known as Rothay Bank. Now it's the Rothay Garden Hotel, and much enlarged all over with glass corridors and so on. Originally a mid-19th century family gentleman's house, close to the river with lovely gardens. And that's the house, essentially, where my brother and I grew up. So by 1949, we were based in these 2 houses, and eventually my mother decided she couldn't cope with both. She sold Beck Allen's. So we just had Rothay Bank, but then we acquired smaller properties around about in a sort of satellite fashion to put guests in, and indeed we ourselves moved over to one of these. My grandmother came from Manchester when she was widowed and joined us in Grasmere. We had a little flat for her over White Bridge near the Swan Hotel. So that's where I grew up. I first went to, as a day girl, to a boarding school in Ambleside, Fairfield, PMU.
Fairfield? My sisters went to that.
Okay. And as you know, Alan, they put tremendous emphasis on literature and art. I remember that each term we all had to learn 2 poems and 2 sections of the Bible and recite these at the end of term to a little panel of staff from memory. And I think the emphasis on literature is something that has stood me in very good stead ever since.
Was there a particular teacher who you remember there as inspiring you or anything?
Not particularly, not at Fairfield, no. In fact, we had a rapid turnaround of teachers because a lot of them were student teachers at Charlotte Mason College in Ambleside. No, I don't remember any particular teachers there.
But you remember literature? Yeah. What age were you? When you went and when you left that school?
Well, I started at 1944, and by the time I was the right age to go to take the 11+, I took the 11+. My father, meanwhile, had become chief examiner for Wiltshire and Gloucestershire for the 11+ exam at his base in Bristol. By this time he was commuting on sort of half-termly basis between the Lake District and Bristol. And Dad, in fact, used me as a sort of guinea pig for improving the 11+ exams. By the time I'd taken it myself, he'd allowed me to mark them. And I believe this is quite illegal, or would be today, but I used to get threepence by script for marking 11+ exams by the time I was 12. Dad always encouraged me to think in ways that I think helped to open my mind to the rest of the world, to things outside and to scientific things. He had a telescope, for example, which he would take us out in the garden and look at the stars and so on. And climbing the fells and so on was also a great love of his. And we have a picture of me, I think at about the age of 3, climbing Silver Howe, swimming in the lake, all those sort of things.
Well, you mentioned literature, and of course you're in the centre of the late poets and Quincy and De Quincey and Wordsworth and Coleridge. Were you very conscious of them as you grew up, or wasn't it?
I suddenly became conscious, really. I mean, we knew all the guests who came to the guest house were always wanting to look at Dove Cottage and where are the daffodils and so on. I do remember all that. It was all a bit of a bore, all these people coming to grasp me, are only interested in Dove Cottage. And where is Wordsworth's grave? And sometimes I would take them there and so on. But it hit me, I think it must have been 1950, which was the centenary of Wordsworth's death. Right? And we had special sort of performances and celebrations, and I had almost completed my time at Fairfield when we, if I remember rightly, we had a reading of the prelude or parts of it, illustrated by tableaus, and I do remember being the young Wordsworth. Now it was not live acting, but it was a series of stage tableaus as the curtains parted. You saw another illustration of Wordsworth's youth. And for some reason I got a prize at that time signed by one of the Wordsworth family. I can't remember exactly what I did, but I have this from that time, 1950, as part of this whole Wordsworth celebration. We got really to about 1950-51, by which time my father is established in Bristol, beginning to plan various trips abroad, seconded from Bristol University, you see. And I then moved from Fairfield to the local grammar school, Kelsey Grammar School in Ambleside. My parents both felt that this would be better for me than staying on as a day girl at this girls' boarding school. And in particular, because my father had been a teacher there during the war for a couple of years, he knew the school, he knew some of the teachers already there, and he thought this would be good for me and my brother later. So I started at the grammar school. It was that was a place where I was very much influenced by individual teachers. For example, Walter Annis, who lived in Windermere, he was the moving force behind the Kelsick Field Club. He organised trips not only up the Lake District fells whenever the rain sort of allowed us, but even in the rain sometimes. And he took us on trips to Derbyshire, to Hope, to South Wales, to the Brecon Beacons. And I think it was on one of these school trips from Kelsick to the Brecon Beacons where we had to climb the Brecon Beacons, but also we went on coach trips that I first came to Oxford. And I remember coming as a teenager on this school bus riding in Oxford, and we were shown around, and so we went to Stratford, watched As You Like It, with Peggy Ashcroft in the title role, Rosalind. I enjoyed that trip very much, and the school also took us abroad to Switzerland, where we were in Grindelwald, is it? And we were taken up some of the climbs in the Alps, which was terrific. So I had this sort of outward-looking field, sort of outdoor experience from being a child, encouraged by the school. The school also had a very lively dramatic society, and I acted in various productions, and I've always loved the stage. In fact, this love of the stage goes back to the time I was, I think, 12, when the Grasmere Players, who were also a very successful and long-lasting dramatic society, going back to the days of Canon Rawnsley, Mrs. Rawnsley. But Mr. Hildrew produced this, invited me to be Puck. So that was terrific. It was performed in a garden in Grasmere with large trees, and the audience sat in a sort of gravelled path area while the performance was done part in forest with just a little lighting, but the moon, I think, probably came out to help. So it was very atmospheric, and I do remember my first entrance. I had to climb up a beech tree partway while the audience all came and sat down, and my entrance was jumping down from this tree. At the time we didn't know, but the painter Claude Harrison, who was resident in Grasmere then and continued to be a Grasmere resident until quite recently when he moved. Claude Harrison was in the audience, and he's always been interested in rather surreal scenes, or characters in clownish costumes against a naturalistic background. Now, one of his early paintings was inspired by that performance. My mother was going round the Lake Artists exhibition the following year. She saw a picture, an oil painting of this sort of forest with strangely gnome-like, pixie-like figures dancing around. And she said, well, you know, that's Wendy there. And indeed it was. So she bought it, even though she didn't have much money at that time, and he was already charging prices way beyond, you know, what you would normally expect to pay for a homemade thing. So we have this picture to prove that I was interested in the stage and acting and so on from an early age, to add to the literature side of it.
What about music?
Oh, it was a gramophone. You
I mean,
mean
your interest
myself?
in music, yes.
I went to piano lessons, but I never did very well. I was a bit scared of my teacher, Mr. Wiener. He was a refugee who'd come over to live in Grasmere, and I was a bit frightened of him. He was quite an elderly gentleman. He used to try and make me sing to clarify the tune of a piano piece, and I've always been a bit shy about singing, and I didn't do awfully well at music, but I did go to dancing lessons. I went to ballet lessons, and in fact my first ambition was to be a ballerina.
You could break ballet shoes, no doubt.
Oh yes. But I took a whole series of the children's exams, and I was working towards one of the more advanced series of exams when, in fact, I I fell doing high jump in Celtic Grammar School and twisted my knee and tore my cartilage in one knee. That put an end really to my career as a ballet dancer, though later when I was an undergraduate I joined the ballet club in Oxford and we put on a little homemade concoction of a piece with just 4 of us in the corps de ballet. I did a little dancing on the stage of the playhouse in Oxford, but
Even though you didn't play music, has music been important in your life? I mean, you listen to a lot of music or be inspired by music, or is it just rather peripheral?
I love music when there is a chance to listen or to especially to live music. But I can't say that it's been more than that.
What, classical music or all sorts of music?
I think I have a sort of ongoing but fairly passive interest in classical music. I made an effort in the field as an anthropologist later. I made an effort to try and hear the patterns of African music and Middle Eastern music and so on. But I've never been much of an expert. I don't claim to be.
The other thing that often happens in about this time, we're talking about 15, 16-year-old, particularly from a Quaker background, maybe. I don't know how serious your parents were as Quakers, but is either you're confirmed or you go through a religious period of denial or acceptance?
My mother was brought up to be a reasonably participating Quaker, but really she was a lapsed Quaker by the time she settled in the north, and she did take me along to the meeting house in Hawkshead, George Fox's meeting house. She used to take me and my brother there sometimes, but it was not forced in any way. When I came up to Oxford, we had some sort of friends who encouraged one to go to the meeting house there. I have been there a few times, but I don't claim to be an observing.
Well, I was going to ask you, I mean, what is your religious position? As an Oxford anthropologist, you've been surrounded by Catholics to a certain extent. So, I mean, are you a believer? Are you an agnostic?
I'm an agnostic, verging on atheist, if you see what I mean. But I can understand the richness of the appeal of religious practice, especially when it becomes a matter of ingrained perspectives and ingrained habits and ingrained love of music and movement and language and ritual. I can understand that, but I'm very interested in how that actually has shaped what we take human beings to be.
Because one of your books was titled something like Ceremonial Animal Role,
yes,
which acknowledged this.
Well, in that book I tried to break down this Durkheimian dualism, sort of dichotomy of sacred and profane, as I've always tried to break down the dichotomy between society and individual. I see this as fields of patterned interaction, and I see degrees of what Wittgenstein famously identified as ceremoniality, degrees of ceremoniality in everything we do. An ordinary conversation is a kind of a ceremonial interaction. If you don't obey the ceremonial rules, you are rude, you are selfish, you are domineering, you are this, that. We are having an extremely structured conversation now, but even an informal encounter has an element of ceremoniality about it, because it's placed in a much wider context of expectation, of moral expectation, if you like, of the nature of the encounter that we are engaged in. What is the wider purpose of smiling at somebody in the street, or winking at somebody, behind someone else's back? There is a whole scenario of understandings, of memories, of past encounters and future intentions and intrigues behind the scene that are encoded and played out in this way. And I do think that in the context of religious ceremony and the deep sort of emotional engagement that individuals can establish with those ceremonies, there is the same quality of what human beings are capable of in terms of passion and emotion. There is the same quality that you find in ordinary life, but much more condensed, much deeper. So in the ceremonial animal, I try to draw out that argument. In anthropology, we talk about time being structured, space being organised, and things being classified, and there being styles of art and so on. But one needs to put this all together and to see how all these things are co-present in our interactions in a manner that is specifically, and I would say uniquely, Homo sapiens, but nowadays one has to think of our more immediate ancestors in an inclusive way. But certainly, but if one is to ask what are the sort of root questions about the nature of our humanity as a species, it must lie somewhere in that quality of art, the quality whereby in every action we are engaging in something wider than what is evident to a naive observer. There are wider patterns in which we are playing a part all the time, and recreating patterns perhaps in new ways. That's why I'm interested, I think, in the image of the stage of the play, and of the artifice that lies behind our ordinary behaviour, the levels of artifice. I like Kirsten Hastrup's book very much, Shakespeare, Anthropology in the Company of Shakespeare. I think it's Actors and Acting, Anthropology in the Company of Shakespeare, where she looks at actors and producers, but mainly actors in the Royal Shakespeare Company, and interviews them and gets to know them well, gets them to speak about who they are when they're on stage, how can they become someone else, what is going on. And she generalizes what they say, I think, in a very perceptive manner to at least throw light on the nature of ordinary life. You cannot have here drama on a stage and there ordinary life. And for me, you could add that to the other dichotomies which I think one needs to criticize. You cannot have here the sacred and here the profane, because there are degrees of intensity along that continuum, and one is engaged in a number of these different modes of more or less intense interaction with other people.
Well, we'll come back to
Yes.
this. That was a very fascinating move off into later themes, but let's come back to that in a minute. We're probably just about towards the end of your school time, and you're thinking about what you're going to specialise in. What subjects were you really best at and enjoyed most at school, and did that lead into Oxford? Well, I was best, I think, at maths and English. And in those days you didn't take a vast number of different subjects, but
in the sixth form I specialised in English and maths because I didn't want to narrow my options too far. And geography was the other A-level subject that I did, and I took scholarship exams, I think, in English, where I think I did best in that, of all those exams. And I don't think I did particularly well in geography, but I wanted to travel, I wanted to keep open the option of seeing the world, and so I had those three subjects. Now my teachers and family friends in particular began to say to me and to my parents, look, you know, where is Wendy thinking of going to university? And they said, oh, she should try for Oxford or Cambridge. And my teachers agreed that it would be worth having a go, which in those days meant staying on into the third year, sixth. And I think we looked at the Cambridge requirements, and although I had Latin from O-level, that was okay. I don't think I satisfied the Cambridge entry requirements because I didn't have a science subject of a suitable kind. Oxford didn't mind, as long as I had the Latin, I could apply to do geography at Oxford. So that's what I did, partly because one other person from my school, Kelsey Grammar School, had already got into Oxford. That person was John Mander, son of the headmaster, and he'd come to Oxford to read geography. I beg your pardon, it wasn't history. I think it was history, but he knew a little bit about Oxford. Now, mine was not a school where people were groomed in advance. You just, if you wanted to sit entrance exams, you sat them. I remember doing the Oxford entrance exams in the headmaster's study in his private house. And I was offered an exhibition at St Hugh's. I'd already heard about Marjorie Sweeting, the geographer at St Hugh's, and how she was a very good tutor and this was a very good college for geography. So I was accepted, and I by this time it was the Christmas. I'd done one term of the third year, sixth. By this time my father was in the Caribbean, seconded, as I mentioned earlier, to the University College of the West Indies. And we were all thinking, what should I do during the 9 months or so before I had to go up to Oxford. And my mother, who had spent some time as working for the Fellowship of Reconciliation in the mid-1930s, she suggested I might try to learn German and go and help with good works in Germany. She still had this post-war feeling of Germany needing help and so on. I started a little bit of German. But then my father wrote from Trinidad and said, look, I've found a school who need a geography teacher for a few months. You know, wouldn't you like to come out to the Caribbean and teach geography? So I thought, gosh, this is wonderful. So, you know, one wrote back to him on those little blue ML letters. Yes, I'd love to come. Can you sort of fix it up? And so everything was fixed up. Now, by the time I left, my father was in Jamaica, so I went first to Jamaica, and in those days air travel was very special indeed. I went by boat. I went on a banana boat, Fife's banana boat to Jamaica, and there was my dad, and so spent about a week there, and we saw a little bit of Jamaica, and then I was put back on some boat which took me to Trinidad, and I taught geography in Bishop Anstey High School for Girls in Port of Spain. And while there, I took the girls on trips. I took them to some sort of forest village where they grew cocoa, a very different sort of social setting from the big towns or from the Indian settled sugar plantations. People in forest growing cocoa, you know, very much reminiscent of West Africa, really, cocoa growing villages. So that was all very interesting indeed. I stayed with the family of a sixth form Trinidadian girl whose family background were from South America somewhere, I think, Argentina. So I then came up to Oxford in the autumn of that year.
That's in autumn 1959, is it?
This was 59.
Yeah, the year before me.
I came up to St Hugh's, wrote one of my dissertations, short dissertations we had to do on Trinidad, and started on geography. Now, Marjorie Sweeting, my main tutor in college, was essentially a geomorphologist of limestone, with a reputation of having explored all kinds of limestone caves in different parts of the world. Any part of the world which had limestone, she had been there and explored the cave. However, my interests were much more on the human side of geography from the beginning, and it was during that first year as an undergraduate in geography that I discovered the subject of anthropology. This was through lectures which were part of our mainstream provision at that time, lectures at the Pitt Rivers Museum by Audrey Butt and Ken Burridge, mainly. So week by week we would do, the Bedouins of Arabia, we'd do the Australian hunters and gatherers, we'd do the Eskimos, as they were still called at that time, and I believe we did the Nuer. Yes, we did the Nuer, taught by Audrey Butt, with objects from the museum, pictures and so on. And I thought, gosh, this is really interesting, And back home in the Lake District that year at some point, I bought myself a copy of Teach Yourself Anthropology. And I do remember reading this by myself and thinking the bits that I really liked best were actually about the family and kinship system of the Australian Aborigines. And I thought, that's really interesting. And I do remember also ordering from Sam Reed's bookshop in Grasmere a copy of Evans Pritchard's Social Anthropology, because Kelsick Grammar School had decided they'd better give me some sort of prize, and they wanted to know what book I wanted. I thought, I will ask for this book for a prize. And I was surprised recently moving all my books, because I'd recently retired. I had to move my stuff out of our institute into our home, and I found this book as a prize. I'd completely forgotten about it. Dated, I think, 1960. So it was definitely as an undergraduate I became interested in anthropology, and I started reading things like Evans Pritchard's work, and this absolutely. I fell in love with E.P.'s writing at that time. So in the summer vacation of '61, is that right?
That's your second year, end of your second year.
Yes. The summer vacation of '61, I went to East Africa. This was through following up contacts that were initially made by my father, Macfarlane. But I'd also by this time met many students from Africa in Oxford. It was a boom time for students from African and Asian countries, where, for example, in Africa the universities were expanding but hadn't yet got to the point of being able to cope with graduate students in particular and give their own doctoral degrees, so they were coming to UK universities in considerable numbers. And I remember we had student societies, not only the Africa Society, which I think still survives, but we had the East African Society, we had the West African Society, and many of these countries were becoming independent, so there were parties for Ugandan independence, and parties in London, parties in Oxford, and a great deal going on. So I had a network of friends from East Africa itself by this time, who said, oh, you should go and see my family, or go and see my friends, and so on. And what I managed to arrange was to spend the summer of '61 mainly in what was still then Tanganyika. I passed through Uganda and Kenya, seeing friends in this network, and then I had somehow managed to arrange to have a part-time teaching job at a girls' secondary school, Machame Girls' Secondary School, which is on the slopes of Kilimanjaro. And I managed to hire a little car. So every week I would go up to the school on the slopes of Kilimanjaro, teach for 2-3 days, then come back down to what was then called the KNCU, the Kilimanjaro Native Cooperative Union, which was the centre of social life in Moshi town. And I had a room there, and from that base I gathered material for my dissertation on the lower slopes of Kilimanjaro. This is part of the geography course. Everyone had to do a geographical dissertation. Most people did it in this country. And I got special permission to do a larger area in Africa, so I did this for my undergraduate dissertation. And I used the car to drive around and talk to people, extending my own networks, people growing bananas and on the sides of Kilimanjaro, growing coffee. I visited some Greek farmers who were still there, although the Greek land was in the process of being nationalised by TANU, by the government of Nyerere, which was very powerfully reorganising things at that time, Uhuru and Ujama and so on. Tanganyika had not yet got its independence, that was to come a little bit later, but there was a euphoria in the air about it. It was a very exciting time to be in East Africa, in the early 60s. And I enjoyed that summer very, very much, and this confirmed me in my ambition now to change from geography to anthropology, because talking to these Chaga banana farmers, I thought, gosh, you can't really understand what's going on unless you can somehow speak Kichaga, and I couldn't, so, though I had tried to do a little Swahili. So that was the summer of '61. And by '62, I made my, early '62, I made my application to come to the Institute of Social Anthropology, as it then was, and as you said, Kegel Road. And I do remember being interviewed by EP, probably sitting on this very, very cushion.
Yes.
And Evans Pritchard was quite dry and quite thoughtful, and he said, "So you want to be an anthropologist?" And I said, "Yes, I would like to." And it was very short, very sweet, and I was accepted, and I got a studentship from Westmoreland County Council. Now, another thing I should confess is that I had already met the brothers Leonhardt at what then I think still was the Colonial Services Club in South Berks Road. Later became Commonwealth Services Club, and then it sort of got transformed into various other things. But I do remember going there, partly because of my links with all these African societies and so on, having meetings and going to the pub and going to the Colonial Services Club. And there was a bar billiards room there, and for some reason I found myself brought into this bar billiards, shown how to play bar billiards with my brothers Leonhardt. I do remember...
Which of them, Godfrey or...?
Godfrey mainly, but Peter too, they were both. But I do remember Godfrey saying to me, "Oh, you ought to come and do anthropology. Get yourself a first-class degree, and then you can come and do anthropology with us." So, in fact, it became my first tutor in the diploma. It was not social anthropology in those days, it was the diploma in anthropology, if you remember, Alan. And so we spent quite a lot of time at the Petrobras Museum. I think I must have been one of the last of the generation who actually saw Beatrice Blackwood demonstrating
gosh.
things, including the Australian and we also had classes with Geoffrey Harrison where you had to sort of stick a needle in your thumb and put the blood on a slide and look at it through it and then find out if you could taste grapefruit or not. But it was a very happy time for me doing work as a graduate student in Oxford. St Hugh's College was fine for me as an undergraduate, but I felt only really when I came into the graduate world of anthropology that I was really becoming part of the mainstream of the university. St Hugh's was just a little bit sheltered, and I found it so, having already travelled a certain amount by myself, and having, you know, been a teacher and having been at a co-educational grammar school, I felt St Hugh's just a bit
Too female and too peripheral.
yeah.
Tell me, give me a little pen portrait of Godfrey, because you knew him for many years and he was your first teacher and so on. How would you describe him to someone who didn't know him?
Oh dear. And he was just a very inventive, wickedly inventive, gnome-like character who wouldn't let you sort of just close a conversation. He would always jump in and continue it and change the subject and keep you up into the early hours. He never complained of being tired, he never complained of a headache, he never complained. He was always apparently in excellent health, never went to sleep, never ate anything much, but was always had this absolutely terrific appetite for talking and for jokes and laughter and name dropping and so on. But I can't really describe him.
Some people say that his book on Dinka religion is perhaps the greatest study by an anthropologist of religion or that kind of society. Do you rate it very highly?
Yes, I do. It is not condescending in any kind of way. I mean, as a Catholic convert, by the time he went to the field, I think that any kind of anthropological condescension towards the beliefs and practices of the Dinka had gone. I mean, there is an acceptance on equal terms, really, of the capacities of the Dinka as a society, as a people, and as individual people. There's an acceptance of their capacity for spirituality and for wisdom, which you don't find in most other books that have the detail and the technical grasp that book also has.
It's also a very wide vision of which anthropology was part. He was very interested. It appears in literature and philosophy and all the humanities, really.
Yes.
And then, since they seem to be often bracketed together, Emmons Pritchard himself, who I, just to declare an interest, think was the greatest anthropologist of the 20th century, but you knew him very well. Can you say just a little bit about UP?
Well, I didn't know Emmons Pritchard very well personally. I respected him tremendously, and you know, nobody could be a greater fan of his writing, his scholarship, and his insight into Africa and so on. But I was not one of those who was on familiar terms with him. I do remember when I was an undergraduate still, I was secretary of some organisation, I think it was JACARI, the Joint Action Committee Against Racial Intolerance, and I said to them, look, we could invite Professor Evans Pritchard to give us a talk. And they said, yes, okay, fine. So I wrote him a letter inviting him to give us a talk on something or other. I don't know what it was by now, but it was something like human variety and cultural change, or something very, very general. It was not that title, but it was something very general. And EP wrote me a very brief note back saying, dear Miss James, I'm sorry I couldn't possibly give a talk on those lines in the space of 1 hour. You should get in touch with my colleague John Beattie. So I did, and John gave us a talk. And it was a perfectly nice, decent talk, you know, anthropology and the variety of humankind, or something like this. And John Beattie did very well, he went down fine. So, you know, I felt a bit nervous about EP after that, having got this rebuff, which was not meant to be a particular rebuff. Now, EP, after my first term's tutorials with Godfrey said, oh, I think you should go to EP next. So I was passed on to EP for the Hilary term of that year, tutorials, all very, very almost prim and proper and cut and dried. He'd say, oh, have a look at this book and tell me what you think. Or he'd say, I think one of his subjects was, he gave me some book by an Eastern European author, and he just said to me, would you regard this as Marxism? And so I took it away and read it and wrote an essay, and would read. It was in the days when people read their essays, tutors. You know, that was all right. And at that time, people were routinely moved around, sort of musical chairs. You went from one tutor to another. So the third term, I was given to Rodney Needham. So Needham was my tutor for the final term of that year.
Well, you know, I'm going to ask you about Rodney. How did you get on with him? He was a very meticulous man, as I recall.
Well, at that time I didn't quite understand how ambitious he was, but I know how meticulous he was, to use your phrase, and how extremely focused his notion of what the subject was about. I was beyond redemption, I think, from his point of view, because it was already the Trinity term and we were having our exams almost immediately by the time I became his student. And one day it was very hot. He said, oh, let's go for a walk in the parks. So we were right by the entrance to the parks, and so we walked around the parks. And he upset me. I don't know if you realised this, but he asked me first, so you're doing a special option on East Africa? I said, yes. He said, oh, well, tell me, what is the social structure of the Maasai? And remained silent. So I said, well, they're pastoralists. I didn't ask you about their economy. I asked you about their social structure. So then I sort of, you know, rambled a bit about age sets, which is what he was trying to get at, you know, lineages and age sets. And after a while he said, you're not planning to be an anthropologist, are you? So I said, well, actually, yes I am. And he said, aren't you going to get married? And I swallowed hard and I said, well, I have just recently avoided being married to somebody, and I don't plan to get married in the immediate future. And after this tutorial, walking around the parks, I went home and I cried.
Oh dear, no wonder.
And you know, very shortly we had the exams, and he was I think he was one of the examiners. And I made a very stupid mistake. Ken Burridge was also one of the examiners. I made a stupid mistake because we had these objects put out in front of us. We had to say what they were. And one of the objects was an ostrich eggshell belt of some kind. And I think it was Ken Burridge who said, oh, it might have been Rodney, what is this? Where does it come from? So I said, oh, it's an ostrich eggshell belt from Australia. And Ken Burridge said, I beg your pardon, what did you say? So I repeated it. Of course, it's not from Australia at all, it's from Kalahari. So I got that all wrong and I got a bit nervous. Anyway, they let me continue. And Needham, to continue about Needham, he was my internal examiner for the B.Lit thesis.
Is this the one on animals?
Yes.
That you lent me?
Yes.
Oh,
Because we met about this
yes,
time.
that's
Yes,
that time, and I remember borrowing it. It was my first piece of anthropological detailed reading.
Well, I mean, all of us were sort of blown over by Lévi-Strauss at that time. And I even have a copy of La Pensée Sauvage in French with some violets pressed in the front, which Godfrey Leonhardt had picked for us, several of us, as we were walking down the road to take the diploma exams. He had picked some violets or little pansies.
Violets,
Given-
pansies, yes.
And I kept that in my copy of La Pensée. We were all rather taken with this, and this was all very bright and new and fresh, structuralism and animal classification and so on. And so when it came to the B.Lit exam, I do remember Needham said, you say in this thesis that you have been influenced by the works of Professor Lévi-Strauss. I said yes. He said, I fail to see any relationship between the ideas of Lévi-Strauss and what you have put in this thesis. So,
No doubt there were plenty
yeah,
of footnotes
so-
saying this. I got this idea from Lévi-Strauss.
yes. And, you know, much later on when I came to be appointed, I don't know if we will ever get to this stage in the interview, but, you know, he was not happy with my appointment. He made life difficult for a number of my generation at that time.
Yeah. Well,
Leave that.
no, that's fine. That's very tactfully put. Let's move on. You then went on to do a PhD, or a DPhil, presumably after your MLit.
Well, no. I started looking for money that I could apply for to do field research for a
Yeah.
DPhil. Now, as you'll understand, I was wanting to go back to Africa, either East Africa or West Africa, and I made various applications for, you know, funding grants and research attachments and so on. I think I applied for something in Lagos, and I certainly applied for something in East Africa. I think it was Macfarlane. And I was planning to go to northern Uganda at one point, I'm sure. And then, because it was a time when the research funds, which had supported so much anthropological work in the colonial period, those research funds were sort of drying up. At the same time, the numbers of anthropologists were rising. So, I mean, I was part of a group in the institute. We were more than there had been for some years. You know, the numbers were going up, the resources were going down, and so we were being encouraged to think of ways in which we could do field work, either by taking employment or by other means, because there weren't enough research funds to go around. And a job was advertised in the University of Khartoum, and he said, oh, you should apply for this job. And I do remember Godfrey and Peter telling me in the King's Arms, yes, you should apply for this job in the University of Khartoum. You'll have to learn Arabic and it'll be very good for you. So I applied, and there was an interview in London, and I was offered the job. And it would have been several weeks before I'd have got the results from the other things I'd applied for in East and West Africa, and everyone said I should go to this exam. So I accepted it, and by the following September or so, I was in Khartoum University on a lectureship without a doctorate. Again, it was a time when universities were expanding all over the world, and especially in African countries. And even in the Sudan at that time, although what is known as the old civil war had already been underway for 5 years or so before I arrived, it was a time in Khartoum of optimism and euphoria. It was not thought at that time things would get so bad in terms of that old civil war, let alone what has happened since. There was a feeling that we were working together, Sudanese and British and other foreign colleagues in the university working together, trying to make academic training and academic life suitable for the glorious future of the country. Now, it was while I was teaching in the University of Khartoum that I was able to do field research, and this was part of the understanding from the beginning. Our Department of Anthropology and Social Anthropology and Sociology had a grant from the Ford Foundation to which members of staff could apply to do field research. Now, I didn't go off to the field on my own straight away, but in the first few months I did have the experience of going with one other colleague at the beginning and a number of students to the town of Port Sudan, where the authorities had asked us as a department to provide them with some reports on the state of the slums, really, called cardboard slums around this port city. And so I wasn't yet committed to anything in particular, so I did undertake to do that if one of the senior colleagues helped me get started, Farnham Mayfish, who did what we needed really to get us started. And then twice I went with two students surveying these slums in Port Sudan.
You then went on to do start your great main fieldwork for the
Yes,
people.
as you will know from what I've said before, my interests were really in East Africa rather than the Arabic-speaking world of the northern Sudan. Research in southern Sudan was out of the question because of the civil war going on at that time. So I began to realize how very much more interesting the northern Sudan was. It was not uniformly Arabic-speaking the same and so on, but was full of all kinds of linguistic and cultural diversity and intermixture and comings and goings. And I thought at first I might go to the Nuba Hills, but Ian Cunnison, who's the head of the department, discouraged me for various reasons, partly because we were expecting a new colleague who was coming to the university specifically to work in the Nuba Hills. That was Jim Farris. So I decided I'd make a preliminary trip to the Blue Nile, the southern part of the Blue Nile, which I had read a little bit about, and I had one or two contacts down there. And following this preliminary trip, I decided to put all my eggs in that basket and try to do some exploratory, basic ethnographic exploration down there over the next few years while I was in the university. I had a 5-year contract, and I then used vacations plus periods of research leave to go down and continue my work. Now, I decided to focus on a particular language group, Uruk, partly because they had missionaries, and as a result there were language materials, there were primers for children to learn their own language, to read and write their own language, and there were stories and there were scriptures in the Uruk language. So I was able to hire a young person, the Shadrach Pego Dunya, to help me pick up the language. In fact, we used the tape recorder to manufacture kind of linguaphone courses in Uruk, which I was able to work on my own. He then later managed to get himself readmitted into a school, not in the south where he had been, but in Khartoum. And we would meet back in Khartoum over 2 or 3 years. We would meet at weekends to work on the translation of things and interviews and so on. So when I left the Sudan in '69 and came back to Oxford, it was then that I wrote up my DPhil.
Tell me a little more about the field work. I mean, what was the theme of what you were studying? What was the question? Or had you not yet found out what the question was?
The question was forming itself, I think, in my mind even while I was in Khartoum University teaching, because I think that experience gave me, as I think it has given other people too, if you live and work in a country, especially if you're teaching there in some capacity, you get to know the place from in a more rounded way than if you simply arrive straight into some rural conservative society and study it. So I was already looking for and aware of links between the remoter peripheral areas and the centre and the history of the country, and the complications of living in an insecure zone, close to the edge of a war as it even was at that time. The missionaries, the Uruk had recently been deported before I started my work because they were blamed for the war in the south, for supporting it. One could not have done a kind of closed ethnographic study in a bubble of the Uruk and their culture and their ways of life. One could not have done that. One arriving in such a marginal place, you are aware of different languages, of disturbed history, and it was very soon after I started this work, and even before I really went to the field, I knew that I would have to take a much more historical line than many colleagues were taking at that time. And indeed, once the very first thing that I wrote up and published was a comparison between what informants told me about the disturbed conditions of the late 19th century, the end of the Turkish Ottoman occupation, and before and during the Mahdist period, before the Anglo-Egyptians came back in 1898 and re-established law and order, as it were. What my informants remembered of that period was raiding, both from the Ethiopian highlands and raiding from the central Nile Valley, and the need to seek security and the movement of people in search of safe havens and so on. This was the world that my informants were describing to me in the 1960s. Either, in a few cases, people who remembered those conditions of the late 19th century personally because they'd been kids at the time, or people who remembered these stories from their parents and grandparents of running in the bush and getting lost and leaving people dying under trees and that sort of thing. And I was able to compare those oral accounts with the archives in Khartoum. And one of the advantages of moving between the Blue Nile and Khartoum city on a regular basis was that I could follow things up in the historical archives, as insofar as they were available to me. In those days, the archivists would not let foreigners look at any file called slavery. You were not allowed to see the slave files, but otherwise you could pick up an awful lot from other files. And my very first article was comparing the archival with the oral accounts of late 19th century disturbances. And from that point on, I've been very, very conscious of memory and of the internalization of political relations in such a way that great emotional load comes with the political memories. And the strong sense of independence and privacy of peripheral communities, and the way in which memories of the past affect what happens later. And of course that comes through in my most recent efforts to try and understand the impact of the latest civil war that convulsed this area, i.e. between 1983 and 2005. I mean, I think that my family background has helped me have a sort of conspiratorial sense of understanding peripheral mountain groups. And even in the Lake District, you know, you're sitting there with the mountains. Manchester is the big city far away. Have you been to Manchester? They've got moving staircases in the shops. Oh, really? And you know, my mother's family from Manchester, there we are in the hills. They come to visit us and so on. But also, I think, even more particularly, the experience of being brought up in a vegetarian family in the 1950s. It was not common at that time. It was really strange when you said, could I have just the vegetables, please, in a restaurant, or even colleges were scarcely used to this idea at that time. And the idea of living in a protected sort of community with a special way of life, and people from all over the world coming to stay in our guest house because they were vegetarian. A sense of sharing things on the basis of how you live, what you eat, and you're generally kind of rather pacifist sort of outlook on politics and so on. Again, I think as a child I had some sense of what it is like to be part of a Jewish family, a Jewish community, because we had many families coming to stay with us at the guest house who were Jewish. They were not vegetarian, but it was quite a well-known guest house and a lovely part of the country. And many people would come just because it was comfortable to be in a vegetarian place. You didn't have to worry about kosher food. And some of my childhood friends were from these Jewish families. It was in that way that Jonathan Webber and I first met. We knew each other as children and lost touch, but the Webber family used to come regularly to our guest house in Grasmere for their holidays. Therefore, the sense of belonging to a very particular kind of community that is transmitted through the generation, and sort of separating yourself off as a sort of minority and feeling yourself to be a minority in a larger setting. I had that very much as a child. I sort of understood that feeling, and certainly in Sudan, I wanted to move to a peripheral area, preferably the mountains because it's all so flat. But I felt a kind of something very sympathetic, and I have tried to follow the fortunes of good people since then in my writings. However, at the end of my time in the University of Khartoum, it was a time of hope for the future, and foreigners were still very much appreciated as colleagues on the staff of the university, and I was offered a new 5-year contract. So I said, no, I'd like to spend more time with my family. And I then came back, finished the thesis at St. Hugh's.
You were being supervised by Godfrey, were you, or by EP?
No, I was being supervised by EP. But I didn't see very much of him in the context of my thesis. In fact, I think I gave him a few chapters one time and said, EP, I've written about half the thesis. Would you have time to look at it? So he said, yes, sure. About a couple of weeks later, he gave it back to me and he said, oh, that's all very fine. No, that's fine, but it's a bit short, isn't it? I said, but EP, that's only half the thesis. And he did occasionally say, well, I discovered the Uruk, which is kind of true in an article of his in Sudan Notes and Records about the...
He wasn't a very sort of nitty-gritty supervisor.
No. But I learned more from talking with Godfrey and with all the Sudanese guests, who would pass through Godfrey's house, northern and southern, but especially Dinka, of course. And one felt very much in touch with the country through Godfrey and Godfrey's networks, Sudanese, and so on. Anyway, I then had the chance to teach briefly for a while in Aarhus in Denmark, where EP had been a very favourite visiting professor, and he was due to go back again in the summer of 71, I think, was it? 71? Was it 70? 70. And there'd been a postal strike, and he'd written a letter to say he hadn't been very well and couldn't come this year. And then eventually somebody rang up, and in those days, you know, international phone calls were very unusual. Somebody rang up the Institute and said, look, we haven't heard from EP, is he coming the day after tomorrow or not? And oh, didn't you get the letter? And so the panic was, who could go instead? Was there someone who could go instead? Well, everyone was busy. John Beattie was teaching. And so on. I was just a research fellow at St Hugh's at the time. Suddenly somebody said, oh, what about Wendy? So I went and had a very nice time teaching in Aarhus for, I don't know, about three months or so. And then one of the reasons that people thought I was suitable was that I'd already been signed up to go and teach in Norway in fact it became 2 terms, it was just 1 term originally, but I was due to go to Bergen, to Frederick Bath's department, to teach there. This was because of the Sudan connection with Frederick Bath's work in his department. I'd met Frederick originally in Khartoum when he came through on his Darfur work for FAO. And because they were short of somebody for a few months, they thought, oh, Wendy could come and keep the Sudanese end of things going in Bergen. So I went to to Bergen, and so the Denmark thing seemed to fit in. And it was from Norway that I applied for what became my job back in Oxford, connected with a fellowship at St Cross. This is because St Cross had Ken Burridge as a fellow, and Ken had meanwhile gone on to Australia, Vancouver, and the college said to itself, we rather like this field of anthropology, why don't we associate ourselves with this brand new lectureship which Maurice Friedman had got from the Institute, and to which I was appointed. So
let me just talk just a tiny bit before we get back to your books and ideas. I mean, you've been a lecturer, and then I don't know if you jumped straight to a professor, but you taught for a very long time in Oxford. Do you enjoy teaching? Did you enjoy teaching?
Yes.
I mean,
not so much the formal lectures, but tutorial work I enjoy. Yes.
And did you find it fed into your research work at all? Some people find they can try out ideas with students and so on.
Oh yes, I think a lot of things that have found their way into my printed work have come partly out of conversations with students and colleagues, but especially students. And I think as the years went by, especially the undergraduate students, the degree of human sciences began in about 1970, 72. I mean, it depends whether you take the first intake at first years. It takes us 3 years to go through, but I taught in that degree from the very beginning. It was designed to be balanced as between the sciences and the social sciences, humanities. I think as the years went by, the weight came down, more on the science side with the rise of genetics and the powerful notions of the new Darwinian thinking and so on. And one found oneself engaged in real discussion and argument with students as a result. And I learned a lot from teaching the human science undergraduates over the decades. I also learned a lot from teaching in the undergraduate archaeology and anthropology degree, which began, I think, in 1990. And this helped me personally, I think, to have the confidence to write about things which were not social anthropology in the narrow sense. And I don't think it makes a lot of sense to speak of that without further qualification. Now, I've I've now found myself working with people in the evolutionary and archaeological world. For example, the most recent book which I helped to edit, Early Human Kinship, with Nick Allen, Robin Dunbar, Hilary Callan, who was a one-time human science undergraduate. We have in it, distinguished archaeologists and biological evolutionary scientists, as well as the social anthropology. And I think what has given me the confidence to engage in what I see as a new generation of conversations across the social biological divide is the experience of so many long conversations with undergraduates who are basically thinking from the science side all the time.
So let me just finally on the sort of practical side, or not really the practical side, I'm very interested in how people think. I mean, creativity is the theme of a lot of these, and that often expresses itself to a certain extent in teaching, but also in writing. One of the reasons I love Edmund Pritchard is that he writes so beautifully, and Godfrey as well. Tell me how you write. I mean, do you enjoy writing, and how do the practical things? Do you go for walks, or do you sit and think, or do you write quickly? Do you write on a typewriter? Anything about your writing?
Well, I do like to find a sort of quiet place, and I get criticised by members of my family for occupying too many rooms and spaces in our house. But I like to have a cleanish space to begin, and to read things relevant and make notes or put markers in books and so on. Now the actual writing, I tend to need to go through many different drafts, which is, seductively easy with a computer, much more than it used to be. But early drafts of things that I wrote, I know I went through many versions of typing stuff out, literally cutting and sticking with sellotape several times to get the argument in the right order and so on. Nowadays I attack things much more quickly, but I still do it in bits and pieces, and as I say, I think the temptation of the modern computer is to take it for granted you can put it all together at the last minute. If you write various notes on topics, you can sort of assemble them. I think I've always tended to work by assembling points or quotations and putting them together, rather than starting on page one. But I've never felt happy about putting them together until I have a clear sense of what the argument is, because having read so many things by other people, mainly students, which don't hang together well, or drafts of papers which people have shown one, I think I've developed a kind of editorial eye for this ought not to be there, it ought to be somewhere else, and I think that helps one with one's own writing, so that I do try to, when I have written out various bits and pieces, try to put them together into a structure, and often that means leaving stuff out, quite a bit out.
You mentioned reading lots of other people's work which wasn't always well structured. Have you done a lot of PhD supervising?
Yes.
Do you know how many PhDs you've supervised over the years, roughly? Or
I think it's roughly about 32.
yeah, that sounds very precise.
Well, I recently sort of looked, but there are 2 or 3 or 4 others that are kind of dribbling along
at the moment, yeah.
At the moment, people who've lapsed and wanting to come back, or people who've, had to do some revisions and not yet been done and that sort of thing. But it's in the early 30s.
And have you enjoyed doing that?
Yes.
PhDs. One thing I encourage people to do is to just reflect on what they consider to be the books or articles that they've most enjoyed and feel are the centre of their life's production. Could you select 2 or 3 books? We talked a bit about your textbook, Ceremonial Animal, but which of your books would you like to be remembered for most, and in what way? And if you can sort of, for a more general audience, outline what, 1 or 2 of the main points in them, that would be even better.
Well, apart from Ceremonial Animal, there are 3 books which are very closely connected that are written by me. The first was a fairly straightforward, if you like, descriptive ethnography, the Uruk, which came out in 1979, called Gwaninpa, which is their self-name, the making of the Uruk people, which I try to explain that what their life was like today had grown out of this very particular history of having to reassemble themselves after periods of dispersal and loss, and remake their homes, and clearing the forest, sort of metaphorically as well as symbolically recreating themselves, bringing in lost people and so on. And that was followed by The Listening Ebony, which I think is the best book that I've written or had a hand in, even, because I really tried there to explore the inner poetry and feeling of stories, songs, and ritual practices, including dancing and the impact of the Christian mission teaching upon them, and the understanding they had of what it meant to be living on the edge of the Islamic world, and to see the ways in which both Christianity and Islam are able to exercise influence and power and spread into their world, and how they have maintained a sort of protective barrier, as it were, around themselves. You can see this in their hymns and music. They have a wonderfully rich tradition of their own music and song, using instruments such as the simple 5-stringed lyre, which you find all over the Nile Valley. And they are very inventive in their use of this lyre, producing lyrics and songs, many of which I recorded in the 1960s. And this tradition goes on being highly creative and innovative. Just last week I was able to watch some video footage taken by an Uruk fellow I once knew, who now lives in North Dakota, and he had managed to visit back home and take some footage over Christmas. And this footage, he very kindly sent me a copy, and it includes a lot of songs by a blind singer whose songs I recorded in the refugee camp in 1994 and 2000. And they're on the lyre, and they are all new. The songs, there are another dozen new songs on this footage. But it is the same singer, it is the same basic style, but it's bubbly, it is full of ferment. And some of the songs produce laughter around the people listening. Some of them were listened to very, very solemnly by ex-combatants, because they're partly about recent war. Now, I recorded songs in this broad style in the 60s, which referred to battles in the late 19th century. And to find, more than 100 years later, battles are still being sung about in basically the same style, I thought was wonderful. And I hope, that in various multimedia ambitions one has, I'll be able to draw in some of these very recent songs being recorded by people themselves, even if they're resettled in Canada or the United States now. Now, the big contrast is with the church music. In the 1940s, 50s, the missionaries produced a hymn book, and together with the people, the project of translating the scriptures into Uruk was paralleled by the production of hymns, Christian hymns. Now they are I noticed at the very beginning when I first got to southern Blue Nile, to the village of Charlie, where the main mission was, at Christmas 1965, I noticed that there was a very rigid sort of schoolroom tone to these hymns. You know, everything sung in unison, rather kind of slow beat, no kind of liveliness, rhythm as the lyre music has. I noticed in the refugee camps, the camps for displaced in the south of Sudan, where I visited some of these refugee groups in the early 90s, and then again in Ethiopia in the formal refugee camps where I went several times. This hymn singing had got harsher and even more kind of rigid. And the recordings that I say I've just seen now of Christmas Day in Charlie 2008, it's even worse. It's even more almost of a military chant. Especially when you saw a male choir. On this footage there's a male choir, and I think it is a choir formed by ex-combatants. I think that's the explanation of it, because there never used to be a male choir. I think these are ex-combatants who are lined up singing Onward Christian Soldiers in this extremely disciplined, and the body language absolutely almost to attention while singing. Now, when I used to go to the refugee camps, I would ask people, haven't you people got any new hymns? Are there no new hymns? You know, I've heard all these before, haven't I? No new hymns, apart from, they said, yes, there was one man who died on the way, he was a blind man. He used to select little bits of the New Testament and put them to music. Oh, I said yes. And I have in fact recorded one or two examples they sang for me, but they were finding it difficult to remember. These were not normally used in the church services, and they had the same rather kind of solemn marching rhythm, and the same rather sort of toneless performance. And the contrast between the mission hymns, which have lasted in the same form but just got more rigid, and the liveliness of the traditional music, I find very interesting, because it seems to me to indicate that these are really different worlds. They're not one world for the people. And the Christian, there is a brittle crust of Christian practice sitting over another world of creativity, which is their home. And the dancing comes into that too. The dancing comes into the non-Christian, and the dancing was explicitly banned by the old mission regime. And even today, you know, people will say, oh, dear me, these young people. It's true they go to church on Sundays, but they all go to the dance ground as well. You know, so that the polarity which had been an external thing between the mission community and the pagans out in the bush, this has become an internal moral polarity for individuals between, you know, in very much the way that you might find it here too. How did we get onto that?
Well, that was the second book.
Oh yes, so in the Listening Ebony, I've tried to do a sort of layered analysis of what belief might be in a community like this, which has a very strong sense of its own internal connections. And then the third book in the trilogy is the recent one of 2007, War and Survival in Sudan's Frontier Lands, Voices from the Blue Nile, which has the website that Judith and I prepared to accompany that book. And in this book I tell the story of what I see is an extraordinary robust capacity for hanging together during the period 1987, when most of the villages were burned. And most of the Uruk became displaced, crossing the international border between Sudan and Ethiopia. Now 6 times. It was 5 times up to the time I wrote the book, but now they are repatriated into the southern Blue Nile, right on the edge of the south, with a pending referendum in which the South may opt for independence, so that the Uruk will be sitting on a new international frontier. It couldn't be more marginal, but you couldn't conceive of a more convincing story of anthropological coherence, of coherence through the matrilateral family links as much as anything else. Despite, the bureaucratic categories of the UN and other agencies which try to sort people out into male household heads as separate units, the Uruk households are all connected through the matrilateral ties, and it's partly that, but I think it is also partly this internal continuing what I have called in the Listening Ebony a cultural archive, an archive not in the sense of actual materials you can pick out, but of the capacity to create new songs in the pattern of songs once heard before, in the pattern of songs once heard neighbouring people sing. So that, the work I've done in Ethiopia too, which we haven't talked about, but I have, during sabbatical leave from Oxford, I was able to do some work in Western Ethiopia in 74 and 75, and I have similar ethnographic portraits of several minority groups on the Ethiopian side of the border. They speak different languages, but they share many musical traditions, and there is a kind of echoing between what one group produces at one time and what another does. There is a lovely instrument played by Uruk girls when the rainy season has begun and the ground is just a little bit damp. You can make holes that preserve their form in damp earth, and you can play them by beating like this. This is called the boobaloo. The instrument is the boobaloo, and after another couple of days it rains and it's gone. Now, I was sitting in Gumuz village in Ethiopia in 75, thinking how to relieve the boredom when I heard going on outside, and I went outside and there was a girl, a Gumuz girl, playing what seemed to be at first sight the same instrument, but the holes were in a different pattern. It was a square with one in the middle, with 5 holes instead of 6 in a row. The sound was the same-ish. And it's that kind of echoing across within. It's as though you had, the Celtic fringe of northwestern Europe, perhaps down and include the Basques or something. But that sort of idea of a peripheral set of linked minorities, however distinct they may seem among themselves, they share more than might be apparent. And that's what I try to evoke in using the notion of the cultural archive in Listening Ebony. Okay, people are inventive and creative and so on, but your creativeness must draw upon something. And I wrote about that, as I said, and I tried to follow that through in the latest book by concentrating on the dancing and the songs, and the transformation of elements of ritual, even though the whole rituals may have gone.
You, there's so many other things. This is smaller points in your writing. One book you kindly gave me a copy of, and I wondered how you've been involved. This was Collingwood's Philosophy of Enchantment, and which I loved, and I reread it from time to time. Why were you involved in this, and perhaps more interestingly, why are you interested in enchantment?
Right. I was aware of R.G. Collingwood as a person whose writings one should look at, especially the autobiography and the idea of history, from the time I came to the Institute, because EP did talk about Collingwood. It's there on the reading lists. Idea of history is there on the reading lists. And I did read a certain amount of the idea of history, and I think probably the autobiography too, when I was a graduate student in anthropology because of that. And then in 1977, I married Douglas H. Johnson, who is a historian, also worked in the Sudan mainly, but we met in Oxford. And as a historian, he was already a fan of Collingwood's. And Collingwood's writings on peripheral areas in the context of the Roman Empire, and his studies of Hadrian's Wall and the relations between military occupying garrisons and the local civilian population, and how the soldiers tend to fall for local girls, and so you have new families and new societies growing up in the civilian settlements near Hadrian's Wall. Well, we saw the same sort of thing going on in the southern Sudan, and we had a whole year based in Juba as a family with our 2 kids, and Douglas and I talked quite a bit about Collingwood at that time. We got back to Oxford to find that there was a conference being held in Pembroke College to mark what? Would it have been the centenary of Collingwood's birth? I think it probably was, yes.
Probably.
Yes. And we went along, and this was organised by a newly formed Collingwood Society, which we then joined. We didn't give any papers at that first conference, but there was an exhibition of some of the manuscripts, and it was through that I got to know Teresa Smith, the daughter of Collingwood's second marriage, who was a baby when he died in 43. She became a leading figure in the field of applied sociology in Oxford, and still is. So it was really through that conference that one met colleagues who were very actively interested in Collingwood, interdisciplinary colleagues, and they had a number of projects, and David Boucher and Philip Smallwood and I eventually managed to produce an edition of what was known then as the Folktales manuscript. It's a manuscript of Collingwood's that various people have been talking about and quoting from the manuscript. All these manuscripts were deposited by Teresa Smith, who was the literary executor, in the Bodleian in the late 80s, I think, if I'm right, so that they became accessible to the public in the normal way. Previously they had been looked after by her personally. And there was then a sort of further flowering of interest in the Folktales manuscript, because it extends the notion of what archaeology might be to the artifacts of language, and the notion of folktales perhaps having an extraordinarily long lineage and connectedness. So various people had toyed with the idea of editing this manuscript and bringing it out, but the team that in fact were able to get down to work and do it were the 3 of us, Boucher, Smallwood and myself, and Boucher being a philosopher, political philosopher really, Smallwood, literary philosopher, and myself as the anthropologist, which clearly, you needed to have an anthropologist on that team. So we enjoyed that very much, and there are further plans for more Collingwood stuff to come out with introductory essays. The press is planning a new edition of the autobiography, for example, and Philip Smallwood and I are supposed to be doing a joint piece to help introduce that.
Fascinating. Well, your mention of his manuscripts being deposited reminded me of a question which people often ask me. It might be useful to have the answer on the web. That is, what happened to Evans Pritchard's manuscripts?
Well, there is no light at the end of this set of questions.
Because Godfrey
if
was
you
his executor, wasn't he?
Yes.
And
Godfrey swears that there is nothing
yeah.
in the way of academic or personal papers that came to him. Now, various papers were physically left in the Institute, mainly notes on his Zandi texts and some Zandi language texts which are not yet fully translated and so on. And a colleague, Margie Buckner, who had been a student of Eric de Dampierre in Paris, a linguistic anthropologist who had worked in the Central African Republic. She is one of the very few people one knows outside Africa who speaks Zandi. And Margie came over and went through these papers that were left in the Institute and wrote up some notes on them and sort of, collated the various bits and pieces of translation and so on. Now, there are various stories about other papers of Evans Pritchard's. The sort of standard story is that he had a big bonfire and burnt them all, partly because he was somewhat irritated at an American colleague who came around sort of suggesting he might do a biography of E.P. Now, I don't know how true all this is, but I think I can't really say very much more except that this question is still an active one. We did approach the family when we had the centenary celebration of E.P.'s birth in 2002, and Shanine, his elder daughter, now Shanine Galloway, was very understanding and accommodating and friendly, and presented the Institute with a specially printed volume of the Zandi witchcraft book, interleaved with blank pages, on which E.P. has been able to write the Zandi texts opposite those parts of the book where there are texts only in English translation. E.P. has put the Zandi onto this in manuscript on these interleaved sections, and Shanine presented us with this book, which is now in the Institute archives. But Shanine at that time, swore that she didn't know of any other relevant papers of E.P.'s.
Did Deirdre come? Is that young?
No, I think Shanine was the only one of the family
Because
who came.
I remember many years ago she was one of our students.
Yes.
And talking to her,
Yes.
and
Yes.
got the impression she knew of something.
Well, as I say, I think these questions may, there may be things that will still surface. For example, just recently, Susan Drucker-Brown here, who, as you know, is working on Maya Fortis' papers with a view to writing about his life and so on. She has come across what she says are a couple of dozen letters by E.P. to Maya. They were very good friends. And she has been asking me whether I can make any suggestions as to where Maya's letters to E.P. might be. So far we haven't got very far, but I have, I'm interested in this myself. I wrote a piece on the Evans Pritchard period in the book that Peter Riviere edited on Oxford Anthropology, History of. And for that I did quite a bit of reading in the university archives, where there are some interesting papers. But still the story is, from anyone one can actually get hold of and ask, that the story is there are no papers, E.P.'s permanent. But we haven't yet systematically followed this through with Deirdre or with the sons.
Are there, well, I've got a couple more questions, but are there any things that you would like me to have asked you about or are important, which I mean there are many, but particularly that you would have liked to have been asked about or talked about?
Well, I mean, I think the Ethiopian side of things, perhaps I could just say a few words about that. When I left the Sudan in '69, I didn't plan to go back. I thought, well, now I can start a new phase of my life, you know, go somewhere quite different to do a fresh piece of research, because many people were doing that at the time. I mean, look at Frederick Barth, you know, various parts of the Middle East, Sudan, New Guinea. Now, I didn't really mean to chop things up as much as that, but I thought I might start something quite different in another part of the world. But it was so for a start, I thought I must go to Ethiopia. So the first time I had sabbatical leave, one term from my job in Oxford, I got an SSRC grant and went to Western Ethiopia and started on what I hoped would be a sort of 3-year program of visits to do an ethnographic survey of some interesting things up and down the western border of Ethiopia adjoining Sudan, in particular concentrating on things like sister exchange, marriage, and one or two other things that looked social scientific and so on. But basically I just, in a funny way, I loved that area and wanted to spend more time there. I wasn't yet married. I went there in '74. I was attached to the University of Addis Ababa, but I saw this as not simply another set of tribal studies in itself, because I never wanted to be regarded as a one-tribe anthropologist or even a tribal anthropologist. I'd tried to write about the Sudan as a whole from the beginning, in a way, and so to prepare for going to Ethiopia, I found 2 or 3 other people in Oxford who wanted to learn Amharic, so we organised Amharic classes with a student in Oxford, and we did that for about 6 months, quite regularly, every week or twice a week having these classes. And I was a bit frustrated when I got to Western Ethiopia because people didn't want to speak Amharic there, although they could. They were either Oromo speakers or speakers of minority languages, but you know, the old government of Haile Selassie was in bad odour at the time, and I found myself in Guma's village for the first time with my Guma's assistant being an Amharic speaker, and also a little bit of English. I was very dependent on him because I didn't yet speak any Gumas. But the young men in the village insisted that my assistant should occasionally give them Amharic classes because they wanted to go to Addis Ababa. Oh, dear me. And so I was very much on my own there without my language helper because he was in demand from the villagers. Now, the Ethiopian project came to a premature end because of the revolution in 74, 75, really late 75, and I couldn't go back in 76. But I would have liked to continue on in not Ethiopian studies as such, but working on the region of Northeast Africa more as a whole. Back in Oxford, together with Douglas and other colleagues, we did organise, I think for about 15 years, a weekly seminar every term on Northeast Africa, and brought people, you know, who were either scholars or journalists or locals from the region for one reason or another, politicians and so on. We had seminars on Northeast Africa as defined from, you know, northern Sudan down to Tanzania. And what I would like to say is that this work I did in the 70s on the Ethiopian side enabled me to make more sense of my trips in the 1990s, when the people I knew from the Sudan side had become refugees on the other side. And it was reflecting on all this. It made it impossible for me to start a brand new piece of fieldwork in Lapland or Brazil.
Yes.
You see, I kept being drawn back because of the interconnections in that region between one side of the border and the other, between centres of those countries, and their own peripheries, between one political event and another, and the connection with the teaching, which got a much broader base than simply my original work on the Uruk. And I hope that that has fed into all my writing, this sense of the historical linkages and between parts of a wider region and the perspective of time in social relations, the sort of historical dimension of what one is looking at any given time. And I think that it's forced me to think much more like a historical witness and even a historian than I ever thought possible when I first came into social anthropology.
Last question. You're a year older than me, and I'm certainly intending to do a few more things with my life. What are you working on now, and what are you hoping to work on? Is it a continuation of this archive that you mentioned, or?
Well, I've still got one or two things that I'm engaged in quite actively. One is the Collingwood essay, which is still in the pipeline, coming along. I'm going to this conference organised by Keith Hart and Alain Caillet in France next month. And there I'm trying to suggest that some of Moses's ideas on the dramatic quality of social life and encounter, some of those ideas are relevant to some of the things that have interested me that are going on the evolutionary side, particularly Robin Dunbar's taking forward this notion that the very size of population groups has been a selective factor in the evolution of the size and complexity of the human brain, especially the frontal lobes where the storytelling and imagination lies, that it is the size of groups and the need to deal with other creatures by clever means and codings and language and so on, that lies behind the selective advantage of complex brains, rather than just looking for widget grubs or making tools. The way that material remains from the past dealt with by the archaeologists is now becoming very much more social, in the sense that Clive Gamble, for example, can see a space which has a round shape and can see that that space is probably there because it was a meeting place, it was a place for dancing, it was a place where there might have been a hearth and so on, and a social gathering. So you don't have to have your solid material culture in quite the same way. And they're thinking of the way in which there can be division of labour and exchange and so on, even in very ancient periods from the material record. And my paper in France is trying to show that Moses' ideas are relevant to all this. But the main thing that I want to achieve in the next couple of years is to sort out my material, not only the textual material from my ethnography, but the visual and audio material. And I was using a tape recorder back in the 60s. I have a large number of audio tapes, many of which I've drawn on in my writing, but not all. And an increasingly large amount of visual material. And there's always the rushes from my film, which I did with Granada, Despairing World, directed by Bruce MacDonald. Nobody quite knows who has the rights over the Russians, but they're quite interesting to me, and would fit, you know, as part of a wider multimedia archive if we can get that integrated, along with new pictures being taken by people themselves in the diaspora when they visit, so that you know, the notion of a usable and interesting multimedia archive on the lines of, you know, what you have pioneered. I'm hoping to produce something useful along those lines too.
Well, this conversation hopefully will go on between us in our collaboration on such matters in the future. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you
Wendy.
very much, Alan.